It's another week and another Shadow Talk. In this week's episode, Richard Gold and Simon Hall join me, Michael Marriott, to discuss the breach of credit card details from Ticketmaster, British Airways, and most recently Feedify by a group known as Magecart. We dig into this group's activities, the different types of techniques that are used, and ways in which organisations can go about protecting themselves from such attacks. All in this week's Shadow Talk. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Shadow Talk. In this week's episode, talk about the latest news. We have with us Head of Security Engineering, Richard Gold. Hello, Rich.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Pretty dandy, thank you. And we've also got the return of Simon Hall. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Mike.
You've been ill for a bit, so it's lovely to have you back.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's talk about the latest news. We've had some theft of credit card details from Ticketmaster, British Airways, and most recently we've seen Feedify, targeted by a group known as Magecart. Now, this group has been targeting e-commerce websites for at least 2 years, and some of the stolen data has cropped up on online credit stores such as Trump's Dumps. Now, the attacks that we're going to talk about today, they're all slight variations on a similar theme. Let's start with where it all started in this recent spate, and that's with Ticketmaster. Simon, what's your take on that?
So the interesting thing about the Ticketmaster breaches were they compromised a third-party provider of JavaScript. So they were able to compromise the third party, and doing this, they are able to gain access to data and scrape data from any organization which was using the same code. So with the third parties, they share the same code base across multiple organizations, so people can just load in their code from their web servers directly into each of their websites. And doing so, if you're not checking the code and you're actually inserting this directly into your web page, you may be adding malicious elements into there, which was the case with Ticketmaster, where this was going directly into their payment processing page. So all that information was being scraped. They managed to do a lot of enumeration, I guess, initially to identify which services were using their code base. And from that, they were able to then leach data from multiple organizations just from one particular compromise, which was quite interesting.
I think it's worth noting at this point that there were a few suppliers to Ticketmaster that were compromised, according to open source reporting. So it seems that it's not just Inventor who were the targets of the Magecart actors. But I think in general, the approach is really interesting. So the attackers were quite savvy, and they went after the places where they could get the full card details, so including the CVV number. So we know from PCI DSS that you're not supposed to store the card number, the CVV number. And the attackers knew this clearly and were able to circumvent this protection by going directly to where the card data was inputted by the customers. So it was what's also pretty smart about that is that then the exfiltration of the payment card data to the attackers was done from the end users' machines. So they didn't have to get involved with the internal systems of Ticketmaster or BA or whoever, but they just relied on the fact that they went after the browser where the card details was being inputted. So they were completely outside of the corporate or production environments where the sort of typical protections are put in place.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the beauty of JavaScript injection, for instance, where you're able to affect the client directly and scrape all of that information, whether that be session cookies in some cases for hijacking, or whether that actually be their direct input for credit card information, personal details, and so forth.
For those listeners who may be unfamiliar with exactly how skimming works, would you be able to provide any more details on that?
Sure thing. So what happens is that on most of these payment card pages where you're putting in your credit card details, the site will have JavaScript, so active code, which will take care of some housekeeping functions or provide some analytics or tracking or some other functionality to the company which is accepting the payments. And what happened is, in many of these cases which has been mentioned, the attackers were able to gain access to a piece of code, a piece of JavaScript that was going to be run on the customer's machine as part of this payment process, or as part of the analytics and tracking that's going on in the background while you're paying. And this is a point in the process where the page sees all of the card details. So when you type in the long card number, the expiration date, CVV value, all these things, this is then visible to all of the JavaScript, so all the code that's running in the background. And by just simply adding a piece of code which checks to see if credit card details were being input, and then sending these credit card details off to an attacker-controlled server, this is a very straightforward way for the attackers to gain all of this access and gain all of this payment card data.
Yeah, exactly. Just to reiterate on that. So yeah, it's basically when you're entering any information on in a web browser, that information is literally just stored in those fields in the page content itself. So JavaScript will render within that browser, and then you're able to scrape any of that information out.
Okay, thanks, guys. Very useful. And obviously, web skimming used as part of Ticketmaster, but also part of the British Airways breach of credit card information. But that one was a little bit different.
Yeah, so the BA one, it seems to be a different approach, or going back to the original approaches. So with Ticketmaster, obviously, they went after the third party, so they can compromise multiple organizations. BA, they went directly, where it appears that they went directly to BA's code that they were holding, which was actually it was a third party script, Modernizer, I believe it was in this case. But it was stored actually on the BA servers, from what everybody can tell. So, I mean, it does appear like that British Airways had one of their content management systems maybe compromised, where someone was able to get hold of this code. But it was a lot more tailored, this approach, rather than the original kind of Magecart stuff where they were compromising just random e-commerce sites. There was a bit of that where they're able to compromise the actual site directly and modify the code, but then there was a whole tailored piece to it as well. So it's slightly, looks like they deviated, and there was some talk about maybe separate groups working together for this.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, I think, because actually I think the compromise of the third party is somehow even more interesting to me, because it's so indirect. You're keeping yourself removed. You are a stage removed, a step removed from the actual target. I think this is really elegant and really, really impressive. And in some sense, almost it's a step backwards to actually directly compromise the target and modify the script internally there. The other interesting thing with this kind of attack is that it completely bypasses so many protections that we typically use. For example, antivirus. There's basically no malware. It's just a small modification to a third-party piece of JavaScript. It'd be a very difficult thing to detect for an end user. And even using something like NoScript, which is typically recommended by diehard security fiends for self-protection, wouldn't really help, because you would have enabled JavaScript for the BA site anyway, because you would need it enabled in order to make a successful payment. So if you'd done that, the Trojan version of Modernizer would have run anyway, because it was served up from the BA site, wasn't a third party, wasn't pulled down from a third party. It was a third party piece of code, but it was hosted by BA themselves. So that NoScript kind of approach wouldn't have protected you either. So it's a very difficult one to protect against.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And what I found really interesting with this is obviously they had some form of access to be able to modify that code tailored to BA. So it wasn't like they were able to compromise the source of that code initially and then stick this in there. It was tailored towards British Airways. You can tell by the domains they use and everything else. So, what I find interesting is why they went for this particular piece of JavaScript when there was multiple JavaScripts executed across their pages, but they chose just the one to do it. I guess it was the one they decided that would do the job and work for them. But also, if you have access to a content management system or any other piece of infrastructure, for me personally, I would probably start looking around to see where I can pivot to or do whatever else. But I guess that they do what they know, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think exactly right. They've clearly got a very, very effective bit of tradecraft there. They know it works for them. They know it's getting them the results that they want. And maybe they just don't have the time or the inclination to then pivot inside of the environment to somewhere else to try and gain further access, to try and get more confidential information, non-public information or whatever. But they've clearly got a workflow set up that works for them. They get the payment card data. Either they're using it themselves, they're sending it on to a third party. You mentioned Trump's dumps earlier, Mike. So there's different ways they can monetize that. They've clearly got a functioning workflow. They're doing one thing, they're doing it well, and clearly being pretty successful.
Well, that's it. I mean, even with taking the domain and the hosting and the certificate into account, they spent probably $300, maybe, depending on the cost of the certificate they actually use, on the actual setup of infrastructure for this. And the amount they're actually make out of selling these details is pretty substantial. So it's not a bad few weeks' work.
Yeah, obviously this has got a lot of headlines and is a profitable technique to use. Do you think, just as the whole crypto jacking coin hive became very popular and lots of people got on the bandwagon, is there a concern here that people may be interested in this space and get involved a little bit more? And if so, what can organizations do to think about protecting themselves from this?
I think it's pretty difficult to say everyone's going to jump on the bandwagon with this type of attack, because there is a lot of footwork that has to go into play first. You have to be able to access a third party's code base or access the organization's code base directly. So you've got to find that particular vulnerability to exploit, whether that's a person through phishing or whether that's actual a CVE vulnerability in an application. So actually, it's hard to say what people are going to start taking. It's hard to say that people are going to start doing this more and more, because you do need that initial vulnerability in place.
And not only that, but you also have to have a way to cash out, to actually monetize the information that you found. So I mean, if you've got, let's say, you get hold of 380,000 credit cards, but you don't know what to do with them, you don't have those connections, you don't have that ability to cash out, then it doesn't really make sense. So really, as an attack style, it makes sense only if you have that cash out path, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like these guys are known for selling on the card details rather than actually utilizing themselves or having a mule network to do cash outs on them. So I don't know. It's a difficult one to say there's going to be an uptick in this, because it does rely on trying to find vulnerabilities somewhere or taking over domains or whatever else. So there's a lot that actually has to be done in order for this to work. I mean, regarding mitigations, I think the main thing is obviously code reviews. So there's a lot of stuff people talking about using third-party content on your pages. So if you're using JavaScript, you can do something called an include in your web page, where you can actually include an external source for the JavaScript, which is what happens with the likes of Ticketmaster and other organizations. So you're including a source from an external web server that you don't know, or maybe you shouldn't trust. So if they get compromised and that code gets changed, you have no control over that. So one of the things you can do is obviously, in certain situations, is try and take that code in-house and perform regular reviews on there or monitor it for changes. So if you know what the code base looks like, you can actually take a hash of that file, for instance, and you can continually monitor that for any changes. There are a few other bits and pieces. But what are your opinions on this, Rich?
Yeah, I think it's really good advice. I think as well, restricting admin privileges so that only a few users, or as few users as are required, can actually make these kind of changes to production code that gets executed in all of your clients' browsers effectively. So that change control mechanism and also that privileged account management mechanism, sort of two things that I'd definitely be looking at as ways to mitigate this kind of an issue.
Yeah, and totally. And I mean, with the BA case, we don't know exactly how they managed to get into their organization to change this code. I mean, it's likely that it was through a CMS somewhere or something similar, or a method to get access to the content management system. But for the smaller e-commerce sites where these guys are known to be targeting, or at least were known to target, it's commonly through a content management system actually having an accessible portal online. So you have a management login, and people quite often don't add access controls to these to block add unknown IP addresses to it, or add additional security mechanisms like 2FA or whatever else. So making sure that any access to that code, I guess this is going back onto what Rich has just said, through your content management systems, just making sure that's locked down correctly.
Yeah, I think really the takeaway for me from this attack and these set of attacks is that the third-party JavaScript that's going into your website should be really considered as extremely security sensitive and subject to the same kind of security reviews, software development lifecycle, whatever that you are using to control your own code. Clearly, the attackers are quite happy to manipulate your third-party code and make off with all kinds of booty as a result. So I think that it's really clear for me from these attacks that this third-party code, which typically people may not have considered to be security sensitive or security critical, clearly is very, very important.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Okay. Thank you, chaps. I think we're at time. Fascinating discussion as usual, and thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
No problem.
Have a great week.